All right then, it's time to get started, so let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we come to open your word to see what you have for us tonight. I pray, Lord, you'll anoint your word as it goes out, anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have me to say, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so we're picking up now chapter 4 of Judges. And you'll remember we finished up last time with this judge was something else. Ehud, he was the left-handed Benjamite, and slipped in and killed the king and delivered Israel. And some people say, well, that was terrible the way he did that. But you find all the way through scriptures that this kind of thing happens, and we'll see it again tonight. It's not always what we do that we're judged by as far as God is concerned. It's whether we do what he wants us to do. And sometimes that looks like it shouldn't be that way. We have this feeling about God sometimes that he has to operate by our rules, but that's not true. He doesn't operate by our rules, he operates by his rules. And really, when you think about everything, all of creation, you could draw a pretty good case for saying, well, God knew before he ever created anything that man would and go to hell. And yet, he did it. And so his values and his plans don't operate to our standards and our rules. And I think that's really an important thing to get a grasp on, because so many people criticize the Bible. Well, it was all bloody, and they point to Ehud and they say, well, this guy was a judge and look what he did, and we're going to look at Jael tonight, and what she did, and it's terrible, No, they operate on a different scale and on a different set of values than what we do. And so we don't often understand what God does, why he does it, and that's why we never will, because he operates different than we do. So last week we learned about Ehud, or the last class about Ehud, and then Shamgar, which we don't know a whole lot about, and he's still a mystery character, because it looks like he may have been judging a different part of Israel from where Ehud was judging. Because we don't hear much about Shamgar, but he was at more of the southern area, Ehud was more of the northern. So we don't know much about Shamgar. But tonight we're going to pick up after Ehud, and we're going to look at an interesting character that really rubs a lot of people's theology the wrong way. So let's start with Judges chapter 4, verse 1. When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Hagoyim. I'm glad there's no rabbis around. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And she sat under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord of Israel commanded, Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor? Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. And Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will. So she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. And he went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. All right, so we see here this same cycle that we're starting to see over and over again. When the judge of Israel died, which was Ehud, who had been judging Israel, then Israel turned back to idolatry and intermarrying. Now, if we just read through this, we get the impression, Ehud died, the next day they all went to pot. Well, actually, that wasn't what happened. Ehud died, and they didn't have this judge. And so people would make their own decisions and would have others judge what was right and wrong. And so eventually, they worked their way back to the same place they were in before. Now, what this tells us, I think anyway, is that when we seek counsel, when we seek judgment from righteous judges, God will have his way, and the decisions that are made will direct us in the way to go. But when the judges are corrupt or the judges are not in tune with God, look what happens. And we see this today, don't we? Look at the Supreme Court. Of course, now we're in a more better balance. But if we had, what if we had all of that bunch heading the Supreme Court? I mean, they're the ones that said, oh, it's okay to abort babies. Now, don't step on an eagle egg.
Right, yeah.
Don't kill an eagle egg because you'll end up in prison for 60 years or something.
Yeah.
But it's okay to kill a baby egg, a human egg. That's okay. This is the kind of thinking that we see in the world. It's all about me, what me wants. And so we see that when we allow our judges to become corrupt or to become liberal-minded in terms of what God wants, and they're not in tune with God, we have these crazy decisions. We don't have to go very far, about 40 miles, and you'll see one of the most insane cities on the face of the earth. Seattle. Insane, the way they do things, the decisions they make, and the laws they pass. And, I mean, it's just crazy from a business standpoint, from a religious standpoint. It's because they're not in tune with God. They've forgotten God. They don't care about God. And so they're using a humanistic, socialistic approach to their decision making. And that's what happened here. It wasn't an overnight thing. This took time. But decision after decision after decision was made not by the righteous judge appointed by God, but by their own understanding. And so they turned back and became wicked again. So we see this is what happened here. Now, because of that, it says God sold them. Now, that he didn't go out and tell, hey, Jabin, give me some money here, It's not that kind of a thing. It just means he turned him over to Jabin. It means that they were so wicked that he sold them. He turned them over. And when you sell something to somebody, they own it. And that's what's meant here. He didn't just allow Jabin to do something. He said, Jabin, you own them. You do what you want. It's yours. Now that's pretty drastic. But that's what God did. He turned him over to Jabin, who was the king of Canaan. Now he lived in a place called Hazor. Hazor. Now if you look on your map, I've given you a map here, if I can find my own, on the back page here somewhere. You can find these places. Hazor is up above the Sea of Galilee, and you see Kadesh and Hazor right next to that big word Bashan. Okay? You everybody find that all right? That is where Jabin had his palace. That's where he ruled from. Now Hazor is an interesting place because it was defeated by Joshua. Joshua chapter 11, verses 10 to 11, Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms, being the Canaanite kingdoms. And he struck all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing. Then he burned Hazor with fire. Wow.
What was that again?
That's in Joshua chapter 11, verses 10 to 11. And you can read the rest of the story and see all about it. But the point here is that Joshua destroyed Hazor. Wiped it out. There was nobody left there. But there was this guy named Jabin. Now evidently Jabin was a relative of the king of Hazor who was destroyed. And so over time he was able to rebuild Hazor. Now why were they able to rebuild Hazor? We go back to the original problem that we looked at the beginning of Judges. And that is that God told them to go and take the land and inhabit the land, rule the land, take it over, it's yours. They didn't do it. They allowed these people to stay there and rebuild cities and build up armies. And now all of a sudden here's Jabin, who is the king of the Canaanites. So he put together this Canaan empire with all of probably other kings, the Canaanites kings. They would never be in this position. You see, lack of activity, lack of not following God's laws and commandments will always put you in a position of opposition to God. It happens all the time. People wonder why they have such a hard time in life. Well, look at what you're doing. Are you following the laws of God? Are you doing what He's told you to do? If not, you're complaining. You know, this is what happens. And so here they were, and he's up in the northern part of Canaan. Now you'll notice this is all this area down here. You wonder how in the world could be influenced all the way through Israel. We're going to find out. I found a captain. With our map, I have it in red. You'll notice where that is. Right by the river Kishon. It's not far from it's not far from Mount Tabor. Probably 8 miles, maybe 9 miles from Tabor, Mount Tabor. But the important part about Harosheth is that this is the Jezreel Valley. If you look from Tyre down to the Kishon River there, and if you just took a strip of that and came just below the Dead Sea and kind of curved it down towards Zephon, that is the Valley of Jezreel. And that was a main valley all the crossroads came through that. So from up at Hirosheth, he had, it was in a mountainous area, a hilly area, he had a fortress up there. And he had 900 chariots of iron. That means these 900 chariots were being pulled by horses. You know. So when any army or any caravan or anything passed by there, his army would go out, stop them, and either demand taxes or tariffs or take everything they had. Now, if you wanted to ship anything, you had to go up to Tyre. Tyre was the shipping area. So if you had things going to Crete or in the other offshore islands or any place else, everything you shipped had to go out of Tyre. So your commerce had to go through the valley of Jezreel. And you couldn't do anything, you know, as far as commerce unless you went south down into Egypt, which was, of course, a lot longer and limited what you could really do. And then, of course, down there you had the Philistines. And so they would stop you when you got down there. So Jabin was able to come in from, not from Hazor, but from Hagersheth. And from there he was able to control what happened in Israel, in Canaan. And it says he was oppressive. No one had oppressed them the way that this Sisera did. And it was because of his chariots. When they rolled those 900 chariots and came down through there, and by the way, the Valley of Jezreel is where they grew everything. This was their fertile crescent, where all the farms were. You remember when we were there, that they had the other valley, which was up at the top, way up here at the beginning of the Jordan River. But at that time, that was swamps. That was not arable land. So the only real land that Israel had that really could grow things as far as cultivation was this valley of Jezreel. And it went down by Jericho. And so when the spies came in under Moses, they were looking at the valley of Jezreel, at what was growing there. Okay? So Sisera would come down through there and steal all of their crops. He would stop their armies or stop caravans. He would stop their commerce. And so it was impossible to live a peaceful life and make commerce or make money or live hard. And so that was Jabin. And probably a lot of this had to do with the fact that Joseph had destroyed Hazor and destroyed that empire. You know, pride and vengeance played probably a big part in what Jabin was doing. So this was the most severe oppression which Israel had been subjected to. Now, of course, it fell heaviest in the tribes of the north. Now, that would include Zebulun and Naphtali. So we have here then this oppression going on. And while this is going on, there was a judge by the name of Deborah. Now we can learn a little more about what judges did from Deborah. Most of the judges, it just says they were judges and they delivered Israel. You know, you've got Samson and you've got Gideon, and you have these different ones. But it doesn't really say much about what were they judging, how were they judging, what were they doing. Here we get a little clearer picture of what was going on. So Deborah, she set up shop under a tree. It was called the palm tree of Deborah. And it was in the mountains of Ephraim. And if you look on your map, you will see Bethel, which is just below Shiloh and close to Gilgal. If you take a look there. And Ramoth was below there, more down towards Gibeah and Ai. Ramoth is not on here on the map, but it was down in that area. Now these are the mountains of Ephraim. And so Deborah would judge under the palm tree. So if you had a dispute, or if you needed a decision, or if you wanted to know what God wanted you to do, you would go to Deborah. Now Deborah was also a prophetess. Now, I was reading some commentaries and reading some things about prophets. And it's really interesting when you see how people try to describe something, you know. They all have their ideas. And I have it down on here. There were men prophets, so there were also women prophetesses. Some of them were Miriam in Exodus 15:2, Huldah, H-U-L-D-A-H, in 2 Kings 22:14, and there were others that were prophetesses. But that word is really very ambiguous in the New Testament. In fact, in both Testaments. What is a prophet? And we have that same question today. What is a prophet? What makes somebody a prophet? Or how do we identify somebody as being a prophet? Now, we look around today, and the kind of the typical idea that we get of a prophet is somebody who prophesies over people. We went to a conference a couple of years ago, and the whole thing was about prophesying over people. And you just need to let yourself go and seek God. You can prophesy over somebody. Well, I've looked through this Bible. I've read it a few times, and I don't see anybody prophesying over anybody else except they were true prophets. Now, I'm going to define my word prophet here in a minute. The New Testament, they didn't prophesy over anybody that I saw, except Peter, and that was when Ananias and Sapphira came and, you know, tried to lie, and there was a little prophecy just before they dropped dead. But I don't see where there was any other prophets involved. What we did see was people who would talk to, say, Paul, when Saul was converted. You had those people that were able to converse with him and tell him what he needed to do. Now that's not prophesying over them in the terms that we think about. It was expounding to them what God was directing them to do. And it wasn't, you're going to have a wonderful life, you're going to be a big preacher, and you're going to do this and make $1 million. It was a matter of, you need to go here and talk to that person. See? So, when we look at New Testament, they're not somebody who is out there in the woo-woo world, which is what I call it, who walks around looking for somebody to prophesy. There was one preacher, and they were extolling this guy. He would get on an elevator and start prophesying over everybody. It's crazy. We had a lady in our church here that thought she was a prophet. And probably most of you, if I mentioned her name, you'd be amazed. She was sending prophecies to Rick every week. None of them ever came true. She's not here anymore. You know, and this is the idea that a prophet can see the future. Well, they get this from the Old Testament prophets, such as Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. They were able to see the see the future. But there were other kinds of prophets too. Don't forget Elijah and Elisha. And they did miracles. They had a different type of ministry from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets. Well, they were able to look ahead. But even if you read their prophecies, a lot of it was based on past scripture from the Pentateuch. They were able to take the word and then project it into the future and say, this is what this is going to do. Okay? So those are all prophets. There's also prophets who are, we would call them more teachers than prophets. They're able to take the word and to break that word down and expound what that word is, and then be able through, just reasoning. I don't mean human reasoning, but I mean there's a reasoning that says this is what's happened in the past, and this is what's going to happen, and and it's inspired. I'm not saying it isn't, but it's not the futuristic, clouds are going to open up and the Messiah is going to ride back down, like we see in Revelation. Those big prophecies, that are so fantastic and wonderful, but they're more the simple, this is what God wants to do. So there are different types of prophecies. Now I find it interesting that a lot of them were talking about Deborah as a prophetess, and they were minimizing what she was doing. They were merely saying she had the gift of wisdom. So she had wisdom to judge. Well, that's probably quite true. But she obviously also had the ability to speak to the future. Because, remember, and we're going to see in here, she tells Barak, because you want me to go with you, you're not going to have the honor of killing this commander. A woman's going to do it. Now, how did she know that? Especially when we see the unfolding of this story and understand all about it, that would be the most unlikely thing you can imagine. So when we talk about Deborah, we're not talking about somebody who probably did any miracles, although we don't know. I mean, it's not recorded. She wasn't probably one who was all the time prophesying over people and all of that kind of stuff. But I think she was somebody who had a word of knowledge, the word of wisdom. She could see the future when it was required. When events were going to lead into something, she was able to expound what that something is. And it was that part of prophet that I think she had. Now I also want to say this, there are some people that, because we have the fivefold ministry, prophet, teacher, pastor, whatever, they think that the prophet should be over the pastor. Now this may seem kind of strange, but I was actually in a church where we had a guy who thought he was a prophet. And we had a board meeting one night, and he was on the board. I mean, he'd been to this church for years. And all of a sudden he said, I got something to say. He said, God's called me to be a prophet to this church. And so as the prophet to this church, I should have the authority over the pastor and over everybody. And by the way, I want to be paid $70,000 a year as the prophet for this church. I'm not talking about some crackpot coming in the door. This guy, and of course the pastor just kind of looked at him, and we were all just kind of, yeah, right, and he said, well, I guess you got a choice. You can either stay on the board and be like anybody else in the church, or you can be the prophet and exit. Go be a prophet somewhere else. Basically, he didn't say it in that words, but that was, and he really read him the riot act, and the whole board stood up behind the pastor and said, no, you're not the prophet here. If you were the prophet, we'd all know that you were the prophet. And so far, you haven't done anything to prove you're anything. but
75,000.
And the reason for that was he was putting himself in the position of Elijah and Elisha. Now, their ministry as prophets, they look at it and say, well, they administered justice and they talked to the king and they did all these things. But there's some scripture that's quite interesting, and I didn't write it down. But there was one passage or two passages in scripture where it says that when Elijah came to town, everybody hid. Everybody ran for cover. You see, the prophets were not well liked, number one. But when the prophet came to town, he always came to bring judgment. You never see where the prophet walked into town and said, oh, hey, you guys are doing so good, I just had to stop by and tell you what a great job you're doing. No. He would come into town and say, there's a problem in here, and we got to deal with this problem. Anytime they went before the king, there was a problem. I mean, think about Nathan. Nathan, it appears, was a good friend of David's. But every time we see Nathan spoken of as a prophet, he was coming to David and saying, David, there's a problem. You see, the prophets, the Elijah type prophet, they were there to point out problems. They were the problem seekers. And not only did they point out the problem, but they also had the solution. And they had what was going to happen if you didn't follow the solution. Now that's far more powerful than just doing miracles. I mean, there's nothing wrong with miracles. I like miracles. I could use a few myself, occasionally. But when you think about these prophets, and you look at these Old Testament prophets, they came with judgment. And I think that was also a part of Deborah. Because when people would come to be judged, it wasn't always just a decision. It was probably a lot of, this person's doing this, what do we do? And Deborah had the answer and the judgment that would fall on that person if it wasn't corrected. And this was how Israel was kept in line, was through judges. All right? So I probably muddled the waters for you more than I helped clear them up, but we have this problem, you know, of defining a prophet. And you can read about prophets, you can go online and you will find more ideas about what a prophet is than you can shake a stick at. But I don't think a prophet is over a pastor. I don't think prophets are here to prophesy over people. I've heard them get up in service and prophesy on and on and on and on about this and that, and nothing happens. The Bible clearly says that if somebody prophesies and it doesn't come to pass, guess what? They're not a prophet. That's how you judge it. We're supposed to judge the spirits except when prophecy. That's the only, as far as I know, the only other one that we judge. Well, other than if you're following or sinning against, you know, the commandments of the Bible, obviously. But otherwise, did it come to pass? If it didn't come to pass, they're not a prophet. Pretty simple. And I've heard them get up in service and, you know, go on and on and on about what's going to happen, how wonderful this is and that is. I've heard them prophesy over people. There's a guy to this day that thinks he's called to preach. He was probably the most anointed worship leader that I've ever seen. I mean, this guy could get up there and just start singing and the whole congregation would just be pulled right into the presence of God. Now that's a worship leader. It leads them into worship. He was anointed like you just can't believe. Voice, beautiful voice, good singer. But here comes the prophet. God has called you to pastor. He resigned from that, took off him and his wife, and they were going to go off and evangelize. That didn't last. He started a church. That didn't work. Last I know, he's got some little church, 20 people up here, someplace around Morton, you know, which is nothing wrong with that, but I think his ministry would have been far greater, reached more people, pulled more people into the presence of God if he'd have stayed where God wanted him to be.
Yeah.
So prophets can be very dangerous if they're not listening to God. All right. So she was a woman of extraordinary knowledge, wisdom, and piety. She was instructed in divine knowledge by the Spirit and accustomed to interpreting His will, who acquired an extensive influence and was held in universal respect, insomuch that she became the animating, I love this, the animating spirit of the government and just discharged all the special duties of a judge except that of military leader. Now this wasn't something that she went out and raised a lot of money and had everybody vote for her. This was she, because of her piety. And we get that because it said she was the wife of Lapidoth. Well, that wasn't, this is English, of course. Actually, that means she was the wife that was all of these things. Pious, and knowledgeable, and well thought of. That's what that word really means. When you look at it, it's not really a man's name. It's rather a denoting of what she was. She was married to this whole thing. In other words, that's what she was. All right. By the way, there's also, I have it in here, that there are persons endowed with special, though not miraculous, gifts of graces for the better understanding and discoursing about the word and mind of God, for praising of God or the like. And you can see First Chronicles 25:1, 1 Corinthians 11:5, 1 Corinthians 14:1, 3, and 4. It's in your notes there. You can look at those, and it talks about the prophets who worshipped and so forth, and it's quite interesting. The thing about Deborah was that she understood the mind of God. Now, in this story, it's kind of interesting because here, I've told you before, I kind of project myself out and I just sit and look at this thing and I just look at the situation and I kind of put myself there. And here's Deborah sitting under a tree. Now, I don't know if she probably had a house or some kind of a building, that was erected there, and it was the court, but it was under the palm tree of Deborah. And I can see her, she's sitting there. Maybe it's a hot day, I don't know, and all of a sudden she says, okay, I guess it's about time. We don't know why she said that. We don't know why. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, she's sitting there. Then she sent and called for Barak. Why did she do that? There is no record that God walked up to her, talked to her, that there was any messenger, any event that spurred this, anything that caused her to suddenly say, we're going to do this. She just all of a sudden, sitting there, said, all right, go get Barak. Look at this way it's written here. What caused her to do that? We don't see where Israel was whining and crying and calling out to God. We saw that with Ehud, right? They were, in misery and crying to God, and God heard them. But we don't see that here. It's just all of a sudden she sends for Barak. I think the reason is because she had the mind of God. And in God's mind, enough was enough. And so God decided that it was enough, and when He decided it was enough, Deborah sensed that through the Spirit of God and said, give me Barak. She didn't ask for a contest. She didn't go out and say, who's my best warriors? She just said, bring me Barak. So Barak must have been a warrior, although when we read around these events, Israel didn't have much training when it came to warfare. Very few knew how to fight. No. And so she calls for Barak. Now Barak lived where was he at? He was from Kadesh. So you can see where Kadesh is. It's up above Hazor. That's where Barak lived. So she sends a messenger to Kadesh. Now I don't know how long it took that messenger to get from the hills of Ephraim all the way up the Jezreel Valley and then up above the Sea of Galilee, clear to Kadesh. It probably took a few days. And then it took a few days for Barak to get back. This isn't an overnight thing. He didn't just come out and jump on a Cessna and fly down there to see Deborah. He had to hoof it. And so she calls for Barak, and she makes an interesting statement. She said to him, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor, take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun? Now in our vernacular, we'd say that's kind of silly. How would he know what God commanded? And furthermore, when did God command this? We haven't seen anything where God commanded anything. But when you are in the mind of God, when God can talk to you and you sense His mind through the Spirit I'm talking about, I'm not talking about natural, seance type stuff. I'm saying when you have that power and that Spirit of God on you, you sense what He wants. It becomes a command. And it is just as much a command as if God Himself stood in the middle of the floor and said, go do this. To her, this was a command. Now what's interesting here is that she uses the word Yahweh. Has not Yahweh, not Adonai, the Lord, not Elohim, but Yahweh, the supreme name of God. It's Yahweh, that the existing one, the existing one. When God is there, it's not a past, it's not a future. God is present. And so when Yahweh says, when Yahweh commands, it's current, it's today. It's always today with Yahweh. And it wasn't just Barak, I want you to go defeat Sisera. It's very specific. You take 10,000 men. Don't take 10,001. Don't take 999. You take 10,000 men from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. This tells us a little bit. God had a specific number. And He did with Gideon. You remember Gideon was 300. And it had to be 300. If He says 300, He doesn't want 301. He wants 300. So it was very specific. It came from two of the tribes that were the most oppressed of all the tribes. They were going to free all of Israel, but it had to come from the most oppressed. When God wants to bring victory into the church, it often comes from those who have been the most oppressed. The ones who have had the hardest time living for God. Those that have had the hardest time finding victory in their lives, when they do, they bring revival into the church. But most of the time, church sits back and says, well, let the pastor do it. I mean, he's the guy, that's never in a problem and always on top of things, Let Dr. Steve do it. He has no problems, He's always around, no problem. Me, I'm down in the mully grubs all the time. I'm always being oppressed. I'm always having to fight for everything, and I couldn't do anything. But God specifically said, you go to the most oppressed. You make your army out of the most oppressed. The ones who it's hardest to live. The one who have a harder time making a living. Who are constantly getting all their stuff stolen. And they're constantly under the rule of this Jabin guy who's maniac, whatever he was. Oppressive. That's who God chose. And so Barak, he said, okay, all right, yeah, that'll be fine. I'm sitting here watching this, I'm sitting there saying, yeah. And he says, okay, Deborah, that would be fine. But I'll tell you what, why don't you go with me? I'll do it if you go with me. It reminds me of Moses. Yeah, God, I'll go, but I gotta have my brother with me. It's interesting. I had a little devotional Saturday at our chapter meeting for CMA, and I was reading in Acts about the story of Moses. And Acts makes a statement that is, to me, very profound. Talking about Moses, he said he was raised the son of Pharaoh, and he was eloquent in speech and deeds. What happened
Yeah.
between Egypt
Yeah.
and the burning bush? Everybody says he was stutterer. I don't think that was the problem at all. I read the story of the Exodus, and I don't see him stuttering before Pharaoh at any time. Of course, I wasn't there, but you know. But he was eloquent when it came to the things around him. But when it came to the things of God, he didn't feel that he could talk. Huh. Does that shed a little more light on Moses? I don't know. But it was an interesting concept that I had never seen. Where did he lose his ability to speak and be eloquent? Could it be from non-abuse? Could it be because he found other interests and he just was, you know, I don't know. But it's something to think about. Back to the story. So, here they are. And Deborah looks at him. And notice this, the way he put this. If you go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. If you go with me, then I will do the will of God. If you don't go with me, I will not do the will of God. Let's put it in a little better frame of thought here. He wasn't telling Deborah, I won't go. He's telling God, I won't go, because Deborah said, Yahweh commanded it. He says, well, I'll do it, but you got to go with me. Why did he need Deborah to go with him? What was Deborah going to do? Now, I can understand him saying, yeah, I'll do this, but I would really like you to go with me. So I have the mind of God with me while I'm leading. I can understand that concept. What I can't understand is if you don't go, I'm not going. God already said, call Barak. Have Barak get 10,000. It was a commandment of God to Barak, not to Deborah. She wasn't supposed to go. Do we often dig our heels into the commandment of God for some unknown reason, or something we can't define, or because it's not convenient for us, or because we're afraid? Or maybe I don't have the credentials to do that. God said, do it. And sometimes we want to fall back and say, but I don't have the credentials. I don't have the ability. I don't have this. I don't have that. Yeah, but God, you don't understand. Yeah, he understands. And yet he gave a very firm, complete commandment, and that is, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. That wasn't something that was arbitrary, and yet we say, well, God will go into the world if you give me some kind of a program. I'll go into all the world if the pastor goes with me. I'll go into all the world and I'll tell them about Jesus if I have a worship band and somebody to preach, and all I have to do is give my testimony. I can do that. It's not what he said. Correct me if I'm wrong. He said go into all the world. So we have some direct commandments that we look at God and say, I'll do that, God, if. If the church puts a program together, I'll do it. If the church does something, I'll go along with it. What are you waiting for the church for? All right. So, Deborah looked at him and said, well, all right, I'll go with you. But you're not going to receive the glory or the honor of killing Sisera. That's what she was saying. You're not going to receive that. This is not going to be a journey that you're going to come back conquering king, conquering commander. Everybody's going to be hollering your name and how wonderful it was that you defeated this king. You know, when David defeated him, look what happened when he came back. You know, oh man, hey, Saul killed his thousands and David's killed his 10,000s. I mean, everybody, oh, this is David. Barak would not have that kind of honor. It would go to a woman. And, you know, I think there's some, well, to me anyway, because women were not considered warriors by any means. They were not, they weren't slaves. People try to make them out to that, but they were subservient to the man. They would not, under normal circumstances, be honored for doing some big thing like this. And the man was the one that was supposed to be honored for doing these things. That was what was expected. But because of his hesitance to do what God commanded, God said, you're going to do it anyway, but you're not going to get the honor. And I think there's a little thing for us to look at too. Sometimes we put our salvation on the line. And we say, well, I'm not doing what God wants, and I'm probably not even going to make it to heaven anymore. But notice, God didn't just yank Barak out, and Deborah didn't say, okay, Barak, you're out of here. Next, bring me another commander. No. He just didn't get the honor that he would have got if he did what God wanted him to do. And God clearly says that we have crowns and we have rewards. He said, lay up in heaven, treasures. But if we're not careful with how we treat the commandments of God, we may not get those treasures. Doesn't say we won't be there, but we may not have all of the riches and treasures that we could have if we had done what God wants us to do. So Deborah said, okay, I'm going to go with you. And they took off. He went to Zebulun, Naphtali. He got his 10,000 men with him. And he went up on top of Mount Tabor. You look on your map, you can see Mount Tabor. It's that blue circle. And the picture, one that I shot last year and when we were in Israel, that is Mount Tabor. Now, if you took all the villages out, there are, by the way, you can go out on the web and put in Mount Tabor, and you'll see some pictures that were taken back around the turn of the century, back in the early 30s and 20s. And there's no town. It's just this mound sitting out there. And it really, I think, gives you a much better picture of what was going on. Now, if I'm not mistaken, we took that picture from the brook Kidron, the river Kidron. If you look, that tree that's kind of there, if I remember right, if my memory's anywhere close, the river was right down below that, I think. And that's about 10 miles, 8 miles out to that mountain. So, Barak, and by the way, on that mountain, you see those houses there on the left of the picture, all of that, it kind of goes up the hill a little ways there, right over in here. Right behind this, on this side of that mountain, there is a trail, or it's still there today. In fact, if you go out on Google Earth, you can see it. It's just a road that goes to the top, very small. But it's kind of like that one we were at, where you took the Sneak Trail or you took the Condola up. Either way, it was like that. It goes this way up to the top. So once you're up there, it would be very difficult for an army to get up there to you, unless they took that road, which you could defend pretty easily. So it was a great place to take your army. So they went up the hill, and here they are now on top of Mount Tabor. Now, we have this little short one verse in here. And if you're reading the story, you automatically stop and say, huh? What's that doing in there? Did somebody put it in the wrong place? And this is the encampment of Heber. And this is a simple verse. It says, now Heber, the Kenite of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zanim, which is beside Kadesh. And you wonder what that's doing here. Well, it's very important to the story, that we understand what's going on here. Now, Heber was a Canaanite. He was the descendant of Hobab, who was the father-in-law of Moses. You'll remember Moses, when he was out sheep herding, he was with the Canaanites, and he took his wife, one of his wives at least, from there. Now, for some reason, Heber didn't stay with the rest of the Canaanites, but he took his portion, and it was probably a very large group of people that were with him, maybe his tribe among the Kenites, and he pitched his tent near the terebinth tree in Zanaim. Now, Judges 1:16 tells us, now the children of Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms, which was Jericho, right, with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. So we have this same group. This is the same Hobab and his group. They went up with Judah out into the wilderness of Judah, the hills back around Ephraim, back in that area, and they stayed there. Now, these were Bedouins. These were shepherds. These guys lived in tents. They didn't build cities, whatever. And we saw some of them out there. You remember? Of course, they have some of the weirdest looking structures. They haul around with them. Some, look like, I don't know what, junk. I don't know what you'd call they were, but they're made out of skins and whatever. And they just travel all over wherever there's grass and moisture, water. That's where they go. And they live off the sheep and all that. So he was a wandering herder. He left the Canaanites. He left the main group. And he and his family and their group, they pitched his tents under a grove of oaks, or terebinths. Terebinths is like an oak tree, in the upland valley of Kadesh, which Condor identifies with Bashan, 12 miles southeast of Tabor, and near Kadesh on the Sea of Galilee. So if you look here on your map, Kadesh would have been on the Mediterranean Sea. Where am I here? Or near the Sea of Galilee. I'm sorry, it was on the other side. You have Mount Tabor. They were south of there, and they say close to the Sea of Galilee. Actually, it was over by Megiddo and closer to Hirosheth. He wasn't very far from where Sisera had his encampment. Now, this migration of Heber the Canaanite, with a portion of his tribe from the south of Judah to the north of Naphtali, perhaps caused by Philistine oppression, because originally they were down in this southern area around Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and the Philistines were oppressing that area. So possibly because of that, they headed north and went up here close to Hirosheth. And it is mentioned here to account for the subsequent narrative, but possibly also because the news of the great muster of the Israelites had clearly taken place recently. And at these army, putting the army together, had probably been carried to Sisera by some of this tribe of Heber, whose tents were in the immediate neighborhood of Kadesh, which was close to where Sisera was. So in other words, what we're seeing here is these Canaanites were down here in the south area, in this wilderness area. The Philistines, probably because of the oppression, and they're nomads, they're Bedouins, so they headed north. They took their sheep, and they went up into this area by Kadesh. over not far from Harosheth. And under the oak trees, they had probably an encampment there. In other words, it was an area that was well used by the herds, the shepherds, when they Bedouins. And they took their encampment there. And on the way, of course, everybody knew the shepherds, knew the Bedouins, and they were also the what would you call them, the newspaper of their day or the telegraph of their day, and anything that was going on, you could tell these guys, and they'd take it on up the road and they'd tell everybody about it. So, this was the rumor mill that was, followed, I guess you could put it that way. So it's important that we understand they're here. All right, so if we read on, notice what it says now in Judges chapter 4, verse 12, and they reported to Sisera that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor. If you put the two together, you see that it was the tribesmen of Habor, who no doubt told Sisera that Barak was putting together his army and was now up on Mount Tabor. Well, I find this interesting for a couple of reasons, but God said that he was going to send Sisera. If you remember when Deborah talked to Barak, she said he spoke as if the Lord, or she spoke as if from the Lord. I am going to bring Sisera to the river Kadesh. I'm going to take him out of his stronghold. He's going to come down to the river Kadesh, and there you're going to defeat him. Well, how would he ever come out of the stronghold if he didn't know that they were putting an army together up on Mount Tabor? So God used the Canaanites, who was descendants of the father-in-law of Moses, to bring a word to Sisera that God was putting an army together on Mount Tabor. Okay? Interesting. Just a side note, but interesting. Like I said earlier, we don't always understand what God does and why he does it. My first thought was, oh, these guys are traitors. I mean, they were up there with Judah and came through with Israel, and now they're turning against Israel, letting Sisera know what's going on. Well, that was probably all in the will and mind of God. All right, well, let's read on. Verse 13. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hogayim to the river Kishon. So now they're down at the river Kishon. And notice verse 14. Now, they're about 8 to 10 miles away on Mount Tabor. Now, she knew where the army was of Sisera. But notice what she says. Then Deborah said to Barak, up! In other words, get up! Hey, get out of bed! Get up! For this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? Again, here's this strange way of saying God has gone before you. Whew. If God tells us to do something, he will go before us. Mm-hmm. We miss this sometimes. God, you want me to do what? Yeah. But if he tells you to do something, he will go before you. Yeah. All right. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. You know the way you find out if you're a leader? You turn around and see if anybody's following you. Yeah. I mean, put yourselves in their shoes. They know Sisera has 9,000 chariots of iron. Here you are, a ragtag, untrained army of 10,000. And you're going to march down there and you're going to defeat 9,000 chariots of iron, plus the army he has with him. And we don't know how large that was. You know, I mean, I could see one of these guys saying, yeah, right, sure, I'm going to go down there behind you. You head off down there, Barak, and we'll see you when you get back. You know? But when God raises a leader, when the leader moves, he has followers. When I'm teaching leadership classes, I like to use the example of a drum major, you know, going down the road. He can have all of his, I used to be a drum major, you know, the white, the big fur hat, you know, the big baton, you know, march down the road, and all this fancy stuff marching down the road. If I'm marching down the street and I turn the corner and look back and that band's not back there, you know what? I'm no drum major. There's no drum. I'm just some fancy Dan walking down the street. Yeah. So anyway, he went down the hill. All right. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Verse 15. And the Lord, notice this, and the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Now it's 10 miles or 8 miles from Mount Tabor to where the battle was going to be. How long do you think it took him to get there? They say you can march at 2 miles an hour. So there was at least 4 hours probably before the army reached the battle zone. So if they got up early in the morning and started off. But this word routed is an interesting word. You know, here's Barak. He hears that they got this army, and so he gets his troops and he goes down there to the river, and he's determined that he is going to defeat this attempt to overthrow you know, the Canaanites. But he routed. The word routed, hamam, means discomfit, destroy, vex, crush, break, consume, or trouble. To move noiselessly, confuse, make a noise, discomfit, break, consume, crush, destroy, trouble, vex. What God did is he went before the army of Barak. He got them so confused down there. There was so much confusion and everything was, suddenly they're fighting each other. Does this sound familiar? You'll remember when the Assyrians came against Israel, and the king cried out, and they had 100,000 Assyrians out there, and they're going to crush Jerusalem. And they got up in the morning and walked out and looked, and they were all dead. They had turned on each other. There was confusion, there was turmoil, they didn't know who was who, they were fighting each other. How about Gideon? Why did God only need 300 and no swords? Didn't really need them. All they needed was a light and a candle inside of a pitcher, and they broke it, and they got so confused they killed each other. You see, God works differently than we do. So by the time Barak got there, this was such a confusion. It was such a confusion. Look at this. This is, now to me, this doesn't, I mean, if you're a commander, you know, the last thing you're going to do is this. But it got so confusing and everything was such a mess, and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. Here's this guy who is so proud, you know, I have this fancy chariot, I've got my own chariot here, I've got all of this, I'm the commander. And suddenly everything's going haywire. I can see the horses going in the air, they're rearing up, you know. I can see 9,000, or maybe they were double horse chariots, which means you'd have, 18,000 horses, and they're raising up and hollering, and backing up, and if you've ever seen horses who go berserk, you don't control them well. And they were running the chariots into each other. The soldiers are all confused. They're fighting. They don't know what's going on. Sisera says, I'm out of here. He's out of his chariot and on foot and running.
Yeah, amen.
Wow. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagiam, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. You see, there was no battle. By the time Barak got there, Sisera's gone. He's on foot hiding someplace, headed for the oak trees. His chariots are in disarray. The chariot drivers, I can see them trying to control these horses, and all of a sudden here's 10,000 Israelites coming at them. And they got these things turned around, and they got as far as their stronghold when Barak caught them. Now this tells me a lot, because this is chariots with horses. And men got to them before they could get back into their fortress. So they were not controlling these horses well. You know, it was a mess. And so all Barak had to do, there was no battle really. They just cleaned up. Killed off the rest of them, and there wasn't a soldier, not a chariot driver, nobody left. They killed them all. Except Sisera. Wow. Isn't that the kind of battles you want to fight? You just go clean up. Yeah. All right. Now we read Judges 4, 17 to 23. However, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. So it's very possible here, we can kind of infer some things, that possibly Jabin had made friends with Heber and his tribe and offered them protection from the Philistines, who were marauding and carrying on. And so he allowed them to come in there and pasture their sheep. You know, they weren't going to be of any problem. And they couldn't really probably give a whole lot to Hazor, to Jabin, but they were kind of his spies. They were kind of there to tell him what was going on. I'm assuming here, okay, because they were shepherds. You know, they weren't going to have anything much to give to Jabin. So here we have Sisera. He's run up to this encampment under the oak trees. It's not far from his fortress. Verse 18, and Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. And said, then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. Now this would not be, so interesting if it wasn't for the customs of that day. Now this is Heber's wife, Jael. He's the ruler of this tribe. He's the top dog. And she invites Sisera into her tent. Now in those days, the women had tents and the men had tents. The men never went into the women's tent. That was not done unless it was, your relative or something. You didn't invite some man into your tent. You could risk being killed doing that. And she stopped him from getting to Heber. Because if he had got to Heber, Heber would have put him in his tent. But she says, no, come into my tent. And she invited him into her tent. And then she says, you know, you've been running, you're obviously wore out here, lay down, and I'll cover you up with a blanket. I'll hide you under a blanket so nobody will know you're here. And he says, give me some water. Well, in those days, if you gave somebody refreshments, that was a sign that they were under your protection. You'll remember back under Abraham, when the angel of the Lord and his two angels came to Abraham, what was the first thing he did? Offered them food. Because that was a sign that they were under his protection. Now, obviously, God doesn't need his protection. But it was still the custom of that day. And so she brought him into the tent. He asked for water. She brought him milk. Oh, not just water, but milk. This probably put Sisera absolutely at ease. Not only am I accepted here, I'm being protected. She's covered me with a blanket, hiding me, and she brings me the best refreshment, the milk, the best refreshment. All right. And he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you, and says, is there any man here? You shall say no. So, I can see her going over to the tent door and positioning herself by the tent door, just as he requested, and standing there, watching what's going on. I don't know, maybe there was a bunch of Israelite soldiers running around. I don't know. Don't know what was going on there, if anything. But as soon as Sisera had fallen asleep, notice what she does. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. Now, you talk about, come on now, really? How gross a thing would that be? To me, that's worse than cutting his head off or something. You take a tent peg and a big old hammer and wham, 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 put it until it goes down into the ground. She nailed him to the ground. That was that. It tells me a little bit about Jael. She obviously was of a different mindset than her husband, because her husband had been already making allegiance with the Canaanites, and he was trying to make it through, and I'm sure he had every reason why he should do that. But Jael had a different mindset. And her mindset was to say, this is an oppressor of the children of Israel whom we traveled with. They're my friend. It's interesting. Women tend to make friends better than men do. Men will have friends, but they can end a friendship very quickly. Women, on the other hand, seem to be able to establish friendships, and even though they may have a fight or they may, whatever, those friendships remain intact. There's still that feeling. Men is not so much that way. You don't like me, you see the door, leave. Hey, goodbye. We're kind of that way. It's very seldom that men have really close friendships with somebody outside the family. And so I would imagine that Heber, this was just an opportunity for him. It was a business decision. yeah, I'll go up and, you know, I will make friends with the Canaanites, and they're going to help me, and I won't have to worry about the Philistines, and that's a good thing. But to Jael, it was not a good thing. And so she took care of the situation. Verse 22, and then as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man you are seeking." No, he's not here. That was what she was supposed to say. Now, let me show you to him. And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera, dead with the peg in his temple, still nailed to the floor. Still there. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. Did it happen overnight? No. No. This was just a commander. Jabin obviously had other armies, other commanders, other forces. It was an empire, so he could draw from all of these other lesser kings under him. But this was the turning point. This was the day when the commander was nailed to the floor by a woman that Israel was able to defeat Jabin and be delivered from the hands of the Canaanites. Interesting, interesting judge. Any questions? All right. We shall continue next week.